What is Rome? What you call Rome builds a narrative that from the very beginning ties itself to destiny. Even coffee in Italy works like this: espresso or ristretto. Ristretto runs shorter, more concentrated. Italians have an obsession with less but intense. Milk coffee is considered a morning thing in most places. If you order a cappuccino in the afternoon, you might even get a strange look. Americano, on the other hand, is associated with the story of a diluted espresso adopted to the American palate after the war. Think of Rome the same way: a dense core with layer upon layer of the world added on top. When we come to Rome's foundation, what we encounter before truth is legitimacy. You know the legend of Romulus and Remus, the twins set adrift on the Tiber, raised, then one killing the other, and Rome being born. But Rome doesn't settle for the story of two brothers alone. It also has a tradition of tying its origins even further back, all the way to Troy. This is where the Aeneas line comes in, the claim that we are not an ordinary city, we are the continuation of Troy. Virgil's Aeneid is already one of the core texts that strengthens this ideological backbone. Alba Longa, Numitor, Rhea Silvia, and the myth of Rhea Silvia being impregnated by Mars is the most critical part of the whole thing. The foundation is suddenly sanctified with a divine authority. This is something we see often in Rome's state myths. The language of power speaks through divine right and destiny. Then there is the lupa issue, a very elegant and very striking detail. In Latin, lupa means both she-wolf and, in slang, prostitute. So that famous she-wolf image in the foundation myth is not a single reading. In some variants, a very human and dark reality seeps in. It is also discussed that this was later transformed into a wolf through Etruscan iconography. There are even debates that the twin figures on the Capitoline wolf statue may have been added later. In other words, Rome learns very early how to turn myth into image, and image into reality. A symbolic date is also given for the foundation: April 21st, 753 BC, the Varro chronology, and the issue of fratricide. Romulus killing Remus is not just a dramatic detail, it's like a mythological rehearsal of a state mind that says there can't be two on one rope. From the very beginning, Rome embeds the idea of single center into the story.
So, who were the first Romans? Here, one of Rome's most unsettling yet most explanatory claims emerges. The initial nucleus of Rome consisted of vagrants, exiles, fugitives. There's the idea of an asylum, attracting those who want to join the community, then incorporating them into the system and Romanizing them. The story of the abduction of the Sabine women works like a myth for expanding this core. On one hand, a justification for producing lineage; on the other, a tale that legitimizes founding violence. The fact that it has been depicted hundreds of times in art history is no coincidence, because this is the story of self-justification that Rome tells itself. Then, the Latins and the Etruscans enter the scene. The Latins are Indo-European-speaking communities of Latium. Rome initially appears like just one of the ordinary Latin cities. The Etruscans, on the other hand, have an advanced urban culture in north-central Italy. Their political, religious, and urban influence on Rome during the kingdom period is very strong. There are even interpretations suggesting that the name Rome doesn't come from Romulus, but from an Etruscan or local root meaning something like riverbank. Not definitive proof, but it shows this: even Rome itself is not as single-storied as we imagine. Capital, Palatine, the root caput, even within language, the trace of power is present. The family tree of words like capital begins here. If I had to summarize Rome's recipe for rise in one sentence, I would say this: secure internal unity, learn from defeats, steal tactics from the enemy, break alliances, and swallow rivals one by one. Rome's genius is sometimes not the sword, but organization, accepting the migrant and incorporating them into the system, then kneading them with culture. The patrician-plebeian tension is also the major fault line within this system. the struggle between nobles and the people, the emergence of tribunes and assemblies. What Rome calls republic is, in part, the engineering of this tension. In the logic of the transition to the republic, the consulship system is critical. Two co-rulers, annual terms, each able to restrain the other. Rome fears the single man from those early days, but the same Rome also creates the office of dictator when needed, extraordinary and temporary authority, limited on paper, sometimes elastic in practice, and that elasticity will turn into something entirely different centuries later with Caesar. Then we arrive at the question, how did Rome really succeed in becoming an empire? This is where comparisons come into play. For example, interpretations that place Rome and the Ottomans side by side. It is said that Rome ruled by transforming language and religion, eroding identity, and systematically carrying out Romanization, whereas the Ottoman Empire, in certain periods, allowed more room for local institutions to survive and established a different balance through the millet system. Of course, this is an interpretation, but when you look at Rome's concept of pax, it makes you think. Pax Romana is peace in rhetoric. In practice, it often means obedience and taxation in exchange for order. In other words, behind the word peace, there is a very clear language of power. When we come to Pyrrhus, we see Rome's learning reflex clearly. King Pyrrhus of Epirus defeats Rome several times, but the losses are so devastating that the phrase reported as "one more victory like this and we are ruined" enters history as a Pyrrhic victory. This is also where Rome encounters elephants. First shock, then adaptation. In some battles, the elephants even backfire. This is Rome's greatest mastery. Even when it gets beaten, it goes home and studies the lesson.
And the Punic Wars. In the First Punic War, beginning with Sicily's strategic value, Rome catches up in seamanship and copies ship technology, struggling against Carthage's naval power. Then, in the Second Punic War, Hannibal takes the stage. The Ebro Treaty, the Siege of Saguntum, then the Pyrenees, the Rhone, the Alps. This march is not just a military operation, it is a march of psychological destruction. The ambush at Lake Trasimene, the disaster of Cannae. Cannae in 216 BC is described as one of Rome's greatest defeats. And everyone asks the same question, why didn't Hannibal besiege Rome? The answer usually returns to the same points: siege engines, logistics, supply. Taking Rome is not like winning a field battle. Rome's countermove comes with Scipio Africanus, carrying the war to Spain and North Africa, drawing the Numidian cavalry to his side, defeating Hannibal at Zama in 202 BC. Rome's patience and its ability to change strategy once again operate like an imperial reflex. Hannibal's end, with its Anatolian connection, is also much discussed, taking refuge in Bithynia, the story of committing suicide with poison to avoid extradition, even the Gebze connection and the issue of symbolic memory in Turkey, one of the traces history leaves in geography. The final destruction of Carthage comes in 146 BC. There is a political line that turns into the slogan, "Carthage must be destroyed." Cato's association with the phrase Carthago delenda est is no coincidence. In the Third Punic War, the city is burned and razed, an attempt to erase memory. Rome sometimes is not content with defeating the enemy, it wants to erase the enemy's memory as well, to the point that Carthaginian lands are said to be covered with salt so that agriculture can never be practiced again. When we speak of Roman law, the 12 tables cannot be omitted. Around 450 BC, codification, the visibility of citizens' rights. Then, in the imperial age, law becomes a gigantic system. Praetorian edicts, senatorial decrees, imperial rescripts, classical jurists. Rome's permanence lies partly here, paper as much as the sword. On the road to Caesar, there are the Gallic campaigns, 58 to 50 BC. These campaigns bring money to Rome, prestige to Caesar, and the army's personal loyalty to Caesar. Ancient texts speak of figures like 1 million dead, 1 million enslaved.
Modern historiography suggests these may be exaggerated, but debate aside, the violence of the war is indisputable. Caesar's pirate anecdote also summarizes his character. He mocks the ransom, then hunts them down after being freed. This confidence is both fascinating and dangerous in Roman politics. The legacy of the name Caesar, turning into Kaiser and Tsar, is like the cultural shadow of the empire. There is a trail extending to place names like Caesarea or Kayseri in Anatolia. And the Great Rupture. Why was Caesar killed? The label of tyranny, elite rivalry, balances of power. The assassination takes place on the Ides of March, 44 BC. Then Antony's speech, the reading of the will, the turning of public emotion, rhetoric constructing politics. The relationship with Cleopatra also becomes central in this period, a political and personal alliance that turns Rome's civil war into an international story. The post-Caesar order seems to run for a while through a triumvirate, then it turns into a reckoning between Octavian and Antony. After Actium, only one man remains, Octavian, but he does not shout, "I am emperor." Instead, he preserves the guise of the Republic continues and builds the Principate. Institutions remain on paper, but in practice, the first citizen holds superior powers. The title Augustus is like the seal of this ideological framework. Calendar reforms, month names, Rome even brands time itself. Religion opens an entirely different layer here. Roman religion is state-controlled polytheism, rituals, calendar, imperial cult. People are also drawn to mystery religions like Mithraism, which promise an afterlife, and Christianity, its universal call, its language transcending ethnic boundaries, and then its integration with the state. Councils draw doctrinal boundaries. Religion once again turns into a system in Rome's hands. The Spartacus revolt is another legend in this world. Popular culture has magnified it, yet the historical revolt has ups and downs, disorder, early defeats. Still, the symbolic power of Spartacus shows how Rome both shines and fears in moments of internal war. For Rome, the most dangerous thing was sometimes not the external enemy, but the cracks within. And the dynamics of Rome's collapse, the inability to hold the borders, the cost of civil wars, erosion in economy and manpower. As pressure increases along the Rhine-Danube line, dependence on foederati grows. The tax system strains, the countryside dissolves, cities shrink, coin values are debated, command chains fragment. In other words, Rome does not fall in a single day. Rome slowly creaks under its own weight.
This is why Rome's story is so fascinating. It begins as a city and turns into a world order. It transforms myth into image, image into reality, reality into law, and law into ideology. And in the end, within the vast system it built, it consumes its own energy. Rome's greatest lesson may be this: empires grow tired more from within than from without. And perhaps the greatest reflection of this fatigue and decay is Christianity itself. Christianity was not merely born. For centuries, it fought against Rome and, using Rome's own style, destroyed Rome and its values. And from the ashes, another Rome was born. The papacy and the Middle Ages, Dark Ages. 2,000 years ago, on a dusty, scorching hill in the Middle East, a man was crucified. In that moment, it looked like just one more execution among thousands carried out by the Roman Empire. Ordinary, quiet, a death destined to be forgotten. But when that man died, his followers didn't scatter. Instead, with a strange kind of courage, they stood up. And what he said, first in whispers, then in shouts, they carried into the entire Mediterranean world. When did it begin? How did it become one of the world's leading religions? How did it shape European societies? How did it accumulate power? And how has it survived into the modern day? From the cross to the empire, the history of Christianity. I'm talking about one of the greatest cultural and theological transformations history has ever seen. How the story of a simple carpenter brought empires to their knees, how it took crowns from kings, and how it helped shape the modern world. But to understand this story, we have to go to a time before Jesus, back to the roots, back to the shadows of Babylon. The messianic expectation. Our story doesn't begin in Galilee, it begins far to the east, in Babylon. The year is 597 BC, and what follows, for the Jewish people, it felt like the end of the world. Jerusalem had fallen, Solomon's glorious temple had been destroyed, the chosen people were chained and marched into exile, into the heart of Mesopotamia, into Babylon. And this exile wasn't just a political disaster, it was a massive crisis of faith. Has God abandoned us? If there is no temple, where is God? Those questions ate away at people's minds. And it's exactly in that darkness that Jewish belief went through an incredible transformation. The temple culture, built around sacrifice, began to be replaced by synagogue life, built around reading and preserving sacred texts. And even more importantly, under the influence of Mesopotamian culture, the idea of a cosmic battle began to root, the struggle between good and evil. A desperate people began looking for a savior. Prophets like Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah planted a seed of hope. One day, a righteous king would come from the line of David, and he would rescue God's people from slavery. Over time, this idea matured into the concept of the Messiah, the anointed Savior, the Messiah. But pay attention here. Back then, the Messiah people expected wasn't a spiritual leader. He was more like a political and military figure, someone who would come with a sword and liberate Israel from its enemies. That expectation didn't die. It fermented, it grew, it became a deep, almost universal hope. Centuries passed, Babylon fell, the Persians came, then the Greeks, and finally the Romans. But the longing for a rescuer never disappeared. So when Jesus of Nazareth stepped onto the stage, the ground was already prepared. But Jesus did not match the profile they were waiting for, not even close. Instead of a sword, he said, "Love your enemy." We should never forget this. Jesus was not a Christian. He was a Jew. He was born a Jew, lived as a Jew, and died as a Jew. His goal wasn't to create a new religion, it was to reform what he believed Judaism had become. "I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it," he said. At the beginning, this movement looked like a small, marginal Jewish sect, almost like a local Jesus cult. The followers were few, they were poor, and they were speaking mainly to Jews. So how did this small group end up taking over the world? Here, two critical figures, and one key moment. First, a Roman centurion named Cornelius. Up until that point, this faith was seen as something that belonged to circumcised Jews. But through Peter's vision and through Cornelius, a Gentile, a non-Jew, being baptized, the gates opened wide. Suddenly, this God was no longer framed as the God of Israel alone, but a God for all nations. Second, Paul of Tarsus. If Paul didn't exist, Christianity might have remained a forgotten Middle Eastern sect. Paul was a Roman citizen, he was educated, he was a strategist, and he took the message of Jesus and stripped it from its strictly Jewish cultural framework, translating it into something the Greco-Roman world could understand, almost turning it into a philosophical system. He traveled across Anatolia and Greece, city by city. He wrote letters, and those letters today make up a huge portion of the New Testament. Then come the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, written decades after Jesus' death so that the oral traditions wouldn't disappear. These texts became the backbone of the faith. And then Rome saw the new faith as a threat. Why? Because Christians refused to call the emperor a god, and for Rome, that looked like betrayal. Then underground churches and bloody arenas, especially under Nero. After the Great Fire of Rome, he blamed the Christians. He burned them alive. He fed them to lions in arenas. Under Domitian and Trajan, persecution continued. To be Christian was basically like signing your own death sentence. And the pressure forced Christians underground, literally underground. Think of Cappadocia, that located in Turkey today. Derinkuya, Kaimakli, Ilhara Valley. People who have visited know. Believers carved massive underground cities into volcanic rock, built hidden churches, and worshipped in secrecy to escape Roman soldiers.
But Rome failed to understand one thing. Persecution didn't kill the faith, it strengthened it. Martyrdom created a strange kind of magnetism. When people saw men and women walking into death with a smile, they began to think, there must be something in this belief. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, a thinker once said. Now let's move into the great turning point, Constantine and the religion of the empire. Centuries passed. By the 300s AD, the Roman Empire wasn't as strong as it used to be. Civil wars, economic crises, border violations, it was drowning in problems. Meanwhile, Christianity, despite all persecution, had grown massively. It had reached around 10% of the empire's population, possibly more in some regions. It could no longer be ignored. The year is 312 AD. Before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine saw a vision, a sign in the sky, a cross, and the words "in hoc signo vinces." It means, "in this sign you will conquer." He ordered his soldiers to carve Christ's symbol and that message onto their shields, and he won. Was it a miracle or a political move? We don't know, and probably both. But Constantine understood something. Christianity could become the cement holding a crumbling empire together. In 313, with the Edict of Milan, Christianity was legalized. The hunted became free. But he didn't stop there. To end internal disputes inside the church, Constantine called the Council of Nicaea in 325. The divinity of Jesus was debated, voted on, affirmed, and Christianity became an institution. Then, in 380, Emperor Theodosius took the final step. Christianity became the official religion of Rome. By that point, it had grown to tens of millions. Here's one of the most iconic and tragic parts of the story, from hunted to hunter, the fall of paganism. For centuries, Christians had suffered, but once they gained power, what did they do, you think? Sadly, they often did not respond with tolerance. Pagan religions were declared heresy. Ancient temples, statues, libraries. The Serapeum in Alexandria, one of the great temples of the ancient world, was destroyed. And when you look at Roman statues in museums today, arms broken, heads missing, one of the major reasons is the fanatical destruction of that era. To them, demons lived in those statues. The colorful, multi-god joy of the ancient world was replaced by a strict monotheistic discipline, often fueled by fear. The Olympics were banned. Plato's academy was shut down. As Rome became Christian, the ancient world quietly began to die. And then come the church, kings, and fear. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476, only one institution remained standing with real continuity and organization in Europe, the Church. While Europe slid into chaos, the Church became the only authority capable of maintaining order. Medieval Europe was shaped by three major forces: Greco-Roman legacy, law and administrative structure; Germanic culture, the energy of warrior peoples; and Christianity, the spiritual glue binding it all together. In this era, the papacy could hold power above kings. A king often needed the pope's approval to wear his crown. Bishops began replacing Roman governors. The church wasn't just spiritual, it was political. And ordinary people? Life revolved around religion. Literacy was near zero. Knowledge belonged to the church. The Bible was in Latin, and the average person couldn't understand it. People had to believe what priests told them. Life began with baptism, continued with church bells, and ended with last rites. And the biggest fear was hell, especially purgatory. And the church used that fear very effectively. Indulgences, basically selling forgiveness, selling real estate in heaven. People gave everything they had to avoid suffering in the afterlife. The church grew richer, cathedrals rose higher, but the spiritual core slowly began to rot. In the 15th century, the world cracked open. The discovery of the Americas, Columbus, Magellan, new continents didn't just mean gold, they meant new souls to conquer. Christianity spread from Europe into the Americas, Africa, and Asia, but much of that spread happened through violence. Missionaries arrived with a Bible in one hand and a gun in the other. Indigenous peoples were baptized. Old beliefs were destroyed. For the first time, Christianity became truly global. And then, right in the heart of Europe, rebellion exploded. The year is 1517. A German monk named Martin Luther nailed a document to a church door, the 95 Theses. Indulgences are a lie. No one can stand between a person and God. Everyone should read scripture in their own language. With the printing press, Luther's ideas spread like wildfire. Europe split, Catholics and Protestants. Bloody religious wars followed. Christianity lost its single voice. Individual conscience began to rise. Now we arrive at the Enlightenment and the modern world. In the 17th and 18th centuries, science stepped onto the stage. Philosophers like Kant, Diderot, and Voltaire elevated reason. With the Industrial Revolution, people moved from villages into cities. The church's daily grip weakened. Religion began retreating from public life into private conscience. And finally, when you look at the whole sweep of it, from the tears of a handful of exiled Jews in Babylon, to the blood of martyrs in Roman arenas, to the grandeur of medieval cathedrals, to missionaries deep in the Amazon, it's a massive story. Today, Christianity has around 2.4 billion followers. It shaped art, music, ethics, our calendars, even our holidays. Whether you believe or not, the story of that man crucified 2,000 years ago changed the direction of human history in a way that can't be reversed. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, feel free to share, like, and subscribe. See you on another video.